Well, a very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Hello, welcome to the Curzon Theatre. You found us again, hopefully, if you came and watched last night's show. Apologies for the slight delay. The first port talk ran a little bit over, so I'm going to keep this short and sweet. One of P&O's favourite guest speakers. Please can you put your hands together and give a very warm welcome to Mr. Ken Vard.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to the wonderful world of ships. Welcome to Aurora, a beautiful, gorgeous, traditional ocean liner type cruise ship. My name is Kenneth Vard. My friends call me Ken. I have been working on ships for quite a few years now, and I was on this ship's first voyage, as I was also on Oriana's first voyage. So it makes me a little bit like the ancient mariner. When I was a young man, I used to play, which I thought I was, at Harland and Wolff shipyards in Belfast. I was born in Belfast and brought up there. So Harland and Wolff shipyards became sort of my Disneyland. And I used to watch them building ships, launching ships. I would go to the launchings, and to me they were magical creations. They were going places I wanted to go to, and eventually I did. Many years ago, and it seems now many years ago, I wrote a book that was published. It was called Liners in Art. It's out of print now, but you can get it on Amazon, I believe. And it was for the paintings of ocean liners. Nobody had ever done it before. There was never any books on paintings of ocean liners. There were paintings of sailing ships, clipper ships, and warships, and battles, and all sorts of things, but never ocean liners. And I was always looking for a book with paintings of ocean liners. They didn't have it. So in my ignorance, and a lot of things you do when you're younger is through ignorance. And in my ignorance, I decided I was going to write my own book, which I did. I had no computer. I didn't know how to use a computer. I didn't even know how to type properly, so the whole thing was done in longhand. It took 4 years to research and finally get printed and produced. Beautiful, gorgeous book. I look at it now and I wonder where it came from. I suppose it's a little bit like when you have children. You know them as babies, and all of a sudden you turn around and you have adults standing next to you, and you wonder where did they come from. So that's what my book was. It's sort of way my baby. So my first talk on this voyage, and I don't do cruises, I do voyages. And my first talk is about the shape of ships as seen through the eyes of great maritime artists. During the course of this voyage, I will be speaking to you on 6 separate occasions. Every talk is different. I talk about the interiors of ships. I talk about the famous ocean liners. I talk about Titanic. I talk about the end of the era. So by the time we get back to Southampton, you'll have a pretty good knowledge of what ocean liners and great ships were like in the old days. I don't talk about cruise ships as such. It's a completely different animal. A cruise ship is not a ship intended to go anywhere. It's intended to go everywhere. It's intended to be the destination in itself. You don't actually get on a ship to go anywhere. Not in the old days. When you went on an ocean liner was part of a line company that would go on a definite route between one port and another port and then back again. Weekly between Europe and New York. Monthly, even less than that. In a month, so 5 weeks voyages down south to Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, crisscrossed. The world was crisscrossed with great ocean liner routes. So let's get started, and I'll show you a few pictures if I don't forget to speak into this. We don't have a hand mic today. This is the copy of my book, Liners in Art, and this is one of the beginnings of the whole era. Steam. When steam took over from sailing ships, the steamships looked like sailing ships. And of course, they were very, very unreliable. steam was unreliable at the beginning. So they had masts and they had sails, and many times they ran out of fuel and they would sail part of the distance, but it changed the entire idea of what it was to be on a ship going to a destination. For the first time, shipping companies did not rely on the weather to get from A to B. They could bludgeon their way through the oceans with steam. And here we have one of the very first, Little Britannia, a little ship that was built for Cunard. It looked like a sailing ship. And then they had paddles. They didn't have screw propellers. So they were rudimentary, very uncomfortable. They jumped around a lot, and they seemed to take forever to get from A to B, but they finally did. And then, of course, things changed. They started to create bigger ships. This is the Britannia. This is Samuel Cunard's first ship, with the original Cunard funnel colors. The ship opened the service between Britain and Boston. They didn't go to New York in the early days. They went to Boston. And as I said, they were very uncomfortable. Samuel Cunard created this, the first shipping company, the Cunard Steamship Company, to cross the Atlantic on a schedule. Lovely, but uncomfortable, reliable, and safe. Cunard's idea was, whatever happens, everybody has to be safe in a Cunard ship. The funnel colors, well, they haven't changed. The funnel colors of Cunard were very cleverly thought of, and I don't know how anybody thought of this. But the very first steamships, of course, the engines, the furnaces, the boilers and everything were not that far away from the top deck. They were only about 2 or 3 decks high. They didn't have high superstructures. So the funnels used to get very, very hot. And so hot, in fact, that the paint on the funnels would flake off and the funnel would end up looking terrible after a few days. Cunard didn't want this. He wanted something different. He wanted his ships to look pristine. So somebody came up with the general idea, and I don't know where they got it, was if you mix red lead paint, which they use on the bottoms of ships, and you mix red lead paint with buttermilk, you get a color that goes on a funnel and it can get as hot as anything and it doesn't flake off. So this was the original Cunard orange red. And every Cunarder since then has had exactly the same color. Even the great new cruise ships of Cunard have the same color. Artists. Well, this isn't particularly a story of art and artists. It is a story of artists working with ships or with maritime themes. This is a painting by Toulouse-Lautrec, very famous French artist who used to paint very naughty paintings and very weird pictures of people in bars and prostitutes and all that sort of thing. But he also had a lighter side. And he crossed from Marseille to Algeria on a little French ship many years ago in the 19th century, and he saw this very prim young lady sitting on deck in a deck chair, and he painted it. And it is very unlike anything that Toulouse-Lautrec would paint. But he loved the idea of being on a ship at sea. Being on a ship at sea is like nothing else on earth. Every ship is completely different. No two ships have the same personality, and each ship has its own personality. This was the beginning of the ocean liner era as such. One of the very first beautiful ocean liners from the Inman Line. Inman Line had a few ships that looked like clipper ships, but they had funnels, 3 funnels. They had screw propellers. No longer were ships propelled by paddle wheels. This ship had 3 funnels. She had 3 masts. And originally when she came out, and she came out in 1888, this ship suddenly found that how reliable her engines were, they never needed to use her sails. So the sails were taken off. So this is the first true transatlantic steamship. 1888, the biggest ocean liner ever built, the biggest ship ever built at the time. She was 10,000 tons. Right. I'm not going to bore you with a whole pile of facts and figures, but you should have an idea what tonnage actually means. The tonnage of a ship is nothing to do with the weight of ships. The word, it's a misnomer. The word is different. The word should not be ton at all. It should be tun. A tun was originally a little barrel filled with wine that used to be put into sailing caravels and sent from France to England. And the size of that ship would be how many tuns of wine could be carried. Eventually, the word changed to ton, and a ton became a measurement of interior space, basically. 100 cubic feet of space became a ton, and 100 cubic feet of space became a ton when it was revenue earning. They didn't include the size of the ship with the engine rooms or the open decks or the storage of fuel. It was only the amount of space that was revenue earning. That was a ton. So a ship of 10,000 tons was huge in those days, 1888. But it denoted the interior space, the cubic capacity. They used that tonnage to get the prices that they're going to charge the shipping companies for going into a harbor, for docking, for going through a canal. So the lower the tonnage can be, the cheaper it is to operate the ship. So they have a few little quirks. P&O, for instance, always had smaller tonnages and bigger ships because they had so much open space on deck. And the open spaces on deck and promenade decks were not included in the tonnage. We, on Aurora, are cargo. This room here is space filled with cargo. And that is the tonnage of this ship, almost 70,000 tons. But I digress. This is the lovely city of New York, and the city of New York was the fastest ship in the world at the time, the biggest ship in the world at the time, and probably the most beautiful ship. And she won the Blue Ribbon of the Atlantic as the fastest ship to cross the Atlantic in 1888. But she wasn't alone. The White Star Line, and I'll talk a little bit more about the White Star Line as we go on. The White Star Line had ships, every one of them was built in Belfast. Every White Star Liner was built by Harland and Wolff, and every White Star Liner had names ending in IC. This ship here that I'm showing you in a painting by William Wiley was called the Teutonic. She was also 10,000 tons. She was the same size as the city of New York. She was faster than the city of New York, and she won the Blue Ribbon of the Atlantic from the city of New York. But what was important about this ship was she was designed not only to be an ocean liner, but to be, if necessary, a ship that could be a fighting ship, an armed merchant ship. So she had specially strengthened decks that guns could be placed upon it. Now, in this painting by Wiley, it is showing the Teutonic on her maiden voyage. And her maiden voyage was very, very quirky. It wasn't to New York as intended. It was actually to Spithead. She came directly from her builders in Belfast to Spithead to a naval review that was being given by the then Prince of Wales for his uncle. His uncle was the Kaiser of Germany. And at that point, the Kaiser of Germany was trying to build up his navy and trying to build up his merchant marine to compete with his family in England. Queen Victoria was the Kaiser's grandmother. So the Prince of Wales at that time, who eventually became Edward VII, wanted to show off the might of the British Empire at this wonderful naval review in honor of his grandmother's jubilee, and of course, the Kaiser of Germany. So the Kaiser went aboard the ship. He was shown over the ship. He had his naval aides with him. He was told how powerful the ship was, how well constructed it was, what sort of guns she could carry, the speed she could go. And he was overheard to say, we must have some of these too. 1888. It's not a hop, skip, and a jump between 1888 and 1914. And that was the beginning of the arms race between the German Empire and the Great British Empire. And here we have the beginnings of all that. It's a story in art, in a painting. The Kaiser then decided that he wanted the biggest merchant marine. He wanted the largest ships. He wanted the fastest ships. So he gave orders to his shipbuilders and his ship owners to get Germany not only on the map, to have supremacy on the Atlantic. The Atlantic run was and always had been the most prestigious shipping route in the world, to bring Europeans to America and to bring Americans to Europe. The most luxurious ships and the fastest ships were the ones that made the most money. So he started the building of a whole fleet of ships, incredible ocean liners, 5 or 6 of them. But he thought they would be enormous, and they were for the time. He started off at 14,000 tonners. And the end of that particular little group of ships became 19,000, almost 20,000 tons. Cunard and White Star had nothing of that size. So Germany was ruling the Atlantic. They were strange-looking ships. They had 4 funnels. The funnels were in pairs. They weren't equally divided. And here we have a painting of one of the ships called the Kaiser Wilhelm de Grosse. The Kaiser Wilhelm de Grosse, what an incredible name. The great ships of great maritime nations became symbols of the strength of the nation. They became the nation afloat. And so important were they to the symbolism of a nation that a great ocean liner company would, if possible, build a fabulous ship and have the head of state to name it. So these great German ships were all named and launched by members of the Kaiser's family and the Kaiser himself. All old paintings of ocean liners were all pretty, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm looking for gentle, because they were painted for the shipping companies to be advertisements. So the artists were given strict instructions. We want you to paint our ship. These paintings would then be transposed into posters, calendars, postcards, and distributed to the public as advertisements. So we don't want our ships to be in a rough sea. We never have rough seas. Do not paint our ships sailing away from the viewer. A ship sailing away is a sad ship. A ship coming towards you is a happy ship. Well, that's the way they did it originally at the end of the 19th century, but in the middle of the 20th century, some great maritime artists thought these ships were lovely, but this is not exactly as they were like in life. So an artist, William Muller, did a series of paintings of the old German ships as they would have been in reality on the Atlantic. In a gale, rud shuddering, rolling, pitching, high wind, the smoke coming up from their funnel whipping over the seas. So these was the reality of a ship of 14,000 tons in the beginnings, at the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century. Not all ships were crossing the Atlantic. Many ships, of course, from Britain were going to parts of the empire. And here's a little Orient liner. Lovely little thing. This little ship went between England and Australia, and she was called the Orontes. Only 9,000 tons, painted black, white office works, black funnel. Of course they were painted black. All these ships were fueled by coal. There were steamships. They were coal-fired. You had to load coal. You had to unload clinker and ash. Filthy. So you couldn't have a white ship. The ships were black, and those ships were black right up to the 1930s, until the ships started to be fueled by oil. But here's a little ship leaving Tilbury, bound for Australia, in London, murky, foggy, full of sailing ships. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were more sailing ships sailing out of ports than there were steamships. And here, this is a big painting. It's a watercolor by Kenneth Shoesmith. Kenneth Shoesmith became one of the most famous maritime ocean liner painters of the 1920s and 1930s. He taught himself to paint. He went to school to become a ship's officer. The school he went to was an old wooden wall of Britain, great old battleship. And there she is, sitting in the Mersey, and he calls his painting Ocean Liners and Britain's Might, Past, Present, and Future. So what has he got in this symbolism? He's got the Conway, which is the great ship he's on, the great old wooden wall and sailing ship of Nelson's day. On the left, he has the silhouette of a modern battleship of Britain's modern navy. And on the right, coming up the Mersey towards Liverpool, the greatest ocean liner ever seen at that time, the new Cunard Mauritania. 34,000 tons. The fastest ship in the world, the most luxurious ship in the world, and she also had a sister. The sister ship was Lusitania. I'll tell you a bit more about that in a moment. But here, this wonderful painting that can be seen at the Maritime Museum in Belfast. And here is Mauritania on her maiden voyage, entering New York, belching smoke from her boilers, from her furnaces, escorted by tugs, many tugs, all coal-fired, coming into Manhattan that not yet has grown into the Manhattan that we know. Just the beginnings of a tall building. This is 1907. This was the era before the First World War, when Britain started to rule the waves again. It was a lovely ship. The ship lasted some 35 years. That's usually the lifespan of a ship. What can I say about ships? They're very similar to the people who create them. There's a gestation period, the building. There's a birth, the launch. There's a christening. They're given a name. They're then sent out into the world, and luck has an awful lot to do with what sort of a life they lead. Many of them are lucky. Some of them are unlucky. Some are beautiful, others are not, just like people. Some have wonderful personalities and are loved, and others are not. So the infinity, or the idea that people and ships gel, has been something for many, many years. Even in the days of sailing ships, the sailors themselves loved their ships. They were all known as a she. They had a mother instinct. The mother instinct was they supported life. So this is why a ship is called a she. And of course, as I mentioned, they have a lifespan that can be long or it can be short. This is Mauritania. She lasted all the way through the 14s and the 20s and the 30s. And she even went through the First World War. And she was painted in dazzle paint to be camouflaged. And here she is at the end of her time, at the end of her particular era. Life has moved on. This is New York. This is Manhattan. This is an Art Deco city in the 1930s. This is ultra-modern, glistening, and sailing out from New York, this lovely old Edwardian lady at the end of her life. So ships become time capsules to a large extent. This is her sister, sailing on its last fatal voyage to Europe. Lusitania. Lusitania was almost identical to Mauretania. She also had the blue ribbon of the Atlantic, but she didn't become a troop ship during the First World War. Cunard kept her as an ocean liner, and she went on the usual route between New York and Europe in the war. And in 1915, Germany started all-out warfare, indiscriminate warfare, warfare at sea by undersea boats. Nobody had ever had anything like that before. And they decreed that any ship of a belligerent nation that was suspected of carrying arms for the war effort would be a legitimate target and would be sunk. Cunard and Britain have always maintained that Lusitania was only a passenger liner filled with passengers, many Americans going on a lawful voyage across the Atlantic, even in a war. But subsequently, it has been discovered that that's not exactly true. They haven't proved anything conclusively, but Lusitania actually was sailing with certain arms aboard. They say even the captain didn't know. Nevertheless, Lusitania was approaching Ireland, the old head of Kinsale, 1915, and she was attacked by a German U-boat, and there she was sunk. Tremendous loss of life. Now here in this painting, the funnels look black. The painter, Ken Marshall, swore that from any photographs he saw of Lusitania in the war, her funnels were black. Cunard maintained that her funnels still had the red color, so any U-boat could see she was not a troop ship. Nevertheless, Lusitania was sunk off the old head of Kinsale, 1915, with a tremendous loss of life. Winston Churchill at that time considered that this act would have been enough to bring America into the war, but it didn't. It was just in history as one of the most horrendous sea crimes ever. Before the outbreak of the First World War, Germany decided they wanted to have the biggest ships the world had ever seen. The ships by this time were 30 up to 40,000 tons. So Germany decided that they would build very, very large ocean liners of 50,000 tons. They were enormous things. They became known as the Imperator, the Vaterland, and the Bismarck. The Bismarck was the biggest. She was 54,000 tons. I'll show you more about that in a few days' time. But at the end of the First World War, when Germany was roundly defeated, these great ships were handed over as reparations to the Allies. The Imperator became the Berengaria for Cunard. I haven't mentioned, but every Cunarder had a name ending in IA, such as Mauretania, Lusitania, Berengaria, and usually they were named after old Roman provinces. So when they got hold of the Imperator, they changed her name to Berengaria. Berengaria was an ancient queen of the ancient Britons. So in fact, this was the first queen of New York, of Cunard. Ugly looking ship, huge ship. The middle one became the Leviathan for the Americans, United States lines, and the Bismarck became the Majestic for the White Star Line. So these three huge ships of over 50,000 tons sailed after the war for 2 or 3 different companies and 2 different nations. The Olympic class of ships, 1911, 1912, were Britain's answer to Germany. They were the biggest ships in the world when they were built. Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic. 45,000 tonners. Well, we all know what happened to one of them. And this is Olympic, the only one of the 3 great White Star ships that lasted a lifetime. This is her in the 1930s, at the end of her life, sailing out of Manhattan. And this is the only painting ever done from life of Titanic. It's a painting that was done by Charles Dixon. People always asked him, did you have a funny feeling when you did this painting? Subsequently, the history of this ship is horrendous. And he says, no, not at all. I was in Belfast. Titanic was being completed, finished, ready to go on her maiden voyage. And I went down to have a look at it. It was wonderful. She was floodlit and looked gorgeous, so I painted her at night. I had no premonition about anything whatsoever. Nevertheless, Titanic ended sailing from Belfast to her fate. And this is the only painting from life that ever survived and was ever done. Dry dock in war. Well, what is dry dock? Well, a dry dock is like a big bath. A ship is brought into it filled with water. Well, the dock is filled with water, hopefully not the ship. And then when it gets there, the water is pumped out and it's left high and dry. And that is the way people can go under the hull, repaint the hull, look at the propellers, look at the rudder, do many repairs, and when it's all done, the dock is filled with water and the ship is brought out again. But it gives you an idea of the type and the size of people next to ships. Ships are the largest moving structures ever created by man. At that time, yes, very much so. Now we have the largest moving structures like rockets to the moon and mega oil tankers and cruise ships of over 200,000 tons. So man has still not found his limits. He still builds vast, vast things. And here is the American great ship, the Leviathan, in a storm during the war, painted in her camouflage. And there she is. Everybody knew that this was the Leviathan, even though it's not complete in every detail, but it's the funnel colors, it's the shape of the bow. You don't have to be correct in every detail for a ship to be recognized by an artist. This is another beautiful painting. I absolutely love it. This is a painting that was done by an American artist of the Paris when he went to France to study. It is a painting of the Paris. In fact, there was 3 funnels, but he's only painted. Charles Smear did this, and he has 2 of the funnels, because parts of ships are beautiful. Complete ships are very beautiful, but the shape of funnels, the shape of ventilators and propellers and rudders and lifeboats and davits and windows and portholes, all by themselves are perfect foils for a painting. So here he did this lovely painting of the Paris in 1926. Cunard's answer to Germany and to the White Star was to build 1 superliner, but not 2. Very unlike Cunard. They always used to build ships in pairs or in 3s. But in 1913, early 1914, they built the beautiful ship called the Aquitania, 46,000 tons, the last 4-funnel liner ever to sail the Atlantic. She lasted right up to 1951. And here, a view of a great ship sailing on sailing day. This is the Columbus, a German ship, 1920s, bound for Europe, sailing out of New York. Crowds and crowds of people always used to see these ships off. They waved them off, they waved them home. It was glamour. It was beautiful. It was part of history. Nobody had ever thought of flying the Atlantic in those days, especially commercial. And here, one of my favorite pictures. This was done in the early 1920s. It's the Columbus at sea. If there was an artist suspended over Aurora at this moment, and this is 2019, almost 100 years ago, not that much has changed. The funnel is different, the lifeboats are different, the clothes the people are wearing are different, the sea is the same, the sky is the same, the taste of salt on your tongue is the same, being at sea, traveling, basically the same. They didn't have lectures, they didn't have cinema, they didn't have theaters, but they did have entertainment, deck games, reading, playing piano. They had wonderful shows given by amateurs aboard. And of course, the best and the best fun of all is talk. You talk to complete strangers, you become friends, you gossip. Shipboard gossip is the most exciting news you could ever get, and nothing has changed. She didn't come aboard with him. That's the fifth time I've seen that dress being worn. People gossip, and it is great, great fun, but nothing much has changed in 100 years. Then in the 1920s, Germany decided to throw away all the rules and regulations that the Allies imposed on her at the end of the First World War. And she started to build bigger ships, a new navy, a new air force, a new army, and nobody tried to stop her. Nevertheless, in the 1920s, 1928-29, they came out with the two of the greatest ships to be built in the 1930s, the Bremen and the Europa. Streamlined ships. Now you can see the change of shape of ships. The funnels are low and lean. The superstructure is curved. It is gorgeous, and each one won the Blue Ribbon of the Atlantic. They were both basically destroyed in the Second World War. The Bremen completely. The Europa, not completely. They managed to raise her and rebuild her, and she eventually became the liner Liberté for the French. No, come on. This was part of my life. This shows a ship being built in Belfast. The launching of a ship. I used to watch them being launched. I used to chat with some of these men who built them. Very kind, lived in these horrible, mean little houses around the shipyard. And they built incredible ships. And they built them without any sort of safety whatsoever. Cloth caps and rolled up sleeves and jackets. There were no helmets, there was none of that stuff. There was a lot of injury. But they were very kind to me when I was a young man. And I used to drink tea out of a billy can and eat doorstep sandwiches, and I learned about ships and shipbuildings from these men. And then the French built the most wonderful ocean liner ever created, and I'll be talking completely one talk about this great, great ocean liner. The first ship to ever be 1,000 feet in length. The first ship to come in at over 80,000 tons. The fastest ship in the world in her day. She won the Blue Ribbon of the Atlantic on her maiden voyage. She was the first Art Deco ship. Modernity had come to the seas, and I will show you and give you the story. She had a tragic end, sadly, but what a beauty she was. There she is, the fabulous Normandie. The last ship to sail with the White Star colors was the Britannic, the third Britannic. My favorite. Even today, I consider this my favorite ship because it was my very first. The first time of anything is usually wonderful if it's a great occasion for you. And this was the first time I'd actually sailed on an ocean liner to America. Britannic, only 28,000 tons. I thought magnificent. I thought a floating palace. If I saw it today, I'd probably be horrified. But she was wonderful, and she lasted until 1961, and she was the very end of the White Star Line. And then, of course, at the same time as Normandie was being built in or around, I'll tell you this story as well, Britain built the largest and the most wonderful ship that they had ever had up to that time, the great original Queen Mary. Over 80,000 tons, also won the Blue Ribbon of the Atlantic, but she still exists. She is in Long Beach, California, as a memorial to herself. But she was one of the great wonders of the world when she came out in the early 1930s. America built intermediate liners. They were never really up to sailing many, many ships. They preferred trains to put their money into railways and eventually to put their money into aircraft. But they built some lovely ships. The Washington, the Manhattan, 26,000 tonners, and this is the Manhattan. And here's the Washington, on the cusp of war, picking up survivors from an oil tanker that had been sunk by Germany off the coast of America before America had come into the war. So there was always this sort of skirmishing going on. And then in 1938, they built their great flagship, the SS America. 35,000 tons, very much a Yankee ship, sailing out of Razzmatazz, New York. I owned this painting once. A friend of mine painted it for me, and he says, "What should we call this painting?" I says, "There's only one name. We should call it after George Gershwin's great piece of music, the Rhapsody in Blue." So that is the name of this painting. And then, second Mauretania. There was never another Lusitania, but the second Mauretania was built in 1938-39, went on her maiden voyage just a few months before the outbreak of the Second World War. She was not the same size as the Queen's, but she was equal to the Queen's in luxury. And here, the biggest ocean liner ever built until this century, when Cunard built the newest, largest Queen Mary II. But this is the Queen Elizabeth. And the fastest ship ever to sail on the Atlantic, the great United States. She could do 40 knots on trials. She could do 23 knots in reverse. Aurora is lucky if she does 23 knots going ahead. This ship still exists and is a sorry mess, but I will tell you more about her in one of my other talks. And this is the lovely Shusan, a P&O ship after the war to go to China. But China became communist and the ship never went there, and it went to Australia instead. She was built with stabilizers. The first time an ocean liner had actually been built with stabilizers. I'll explain more in another talk. And here is an old Union Castle ship in Cape Town, a mail ship, and you went down to the ship to pick up your mail. There was no mail deliveries in Cape Town in those days. And the last great ship for the Union Castle line, the Windsor Castle, launched by the Queen Mother. And of course, our beloved old Canberra. Canberra, wonderful, the ship that shaped the future. The Falklands. She became a wonderful ocean liner, and I'll be telling you more about her towards the end of our voyage. And the first little Cunarder to sail after the war, the Media, 15,000 tons cargo and first-class passengers. And the last steamship on the Atlantic, the Stefan Batory, for the Polish Ocean Lines. Ladies and gentlemen, that's me done for today. I will be back tomorrow. I'll be back the next day, maybe the next day, but I don't talk when we're in port, and I hope you'll come and hear some of my other talks. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you. Bye-bye.